Introduction. Although we're accustomed to thinking of grown-ups as more mature than their children, what if some sensitive children come into the world and within a few years are more emotionally mature than their parents, who have been around for decades? What happens when these immature parents lack the emotional responsiveness necessary to meet their children's emotional needs? The result is emotional neglect, a phenomenon as real as any physical deprivation. Emotional neglect in childhood leads to a painful emotional loneliness that can have a long-term negative impact on a person's choices regarding relationships and intimate partners. This book describes how emotionally immature parents negatively affect their children, especially children who are emotionally sensitive, and shows you how to heal yourself from the pain and confusion that come from having a parent who refuses emotional intimacy. Emotionally immature parents fear genuine emotion and pull back from emotional closeness. They use coping mechanisms that resist reality rather than dealing with it. They don't welcome self-reflection, so they rarely accept blame or apologize. Their immaturity makes them inconsistent and emotionally unreliable, and they're blind to their children's needs once their own agenda comes into play. In this book, you'll learn that when parents are emotionally immature, their children's emotional needs will almost always lose out to the parents' own survival instincts. Myths and fairy tales have been depicting such parents for centuries. Think of how many fairy tales feature abandoned children who must find aid from animals and other helpers because their parents are careless, clueless, or absent. In some stories, the parent character is actually malevolent and the children must take their survival into their own hands. These stories have been popular for centuries because they touch a common chord: how children must fend for themselves after their parents have neglected or abandoned them. Apparently, immature parents have been a problem since antiquity, and this theme of emotional neglect by self-preoccupied parents can still be found in the most compelling stories of our popular culture. In books, movies, and television, the story of emotionally immature parents and the effects they have on their children's lives make for a rich subject. In some stories, this parent-child dynamic is the main focus. In others, it might be depicted in the backstory of a character. As you learn more about emotional immaturity in this book, you may be reminded of famous characters in drama and literature, not to mention the daily news. Knowing about differences in emotional maturity gives you a way of understanding why you can feel so emotionally lonely in spite of other people's claims of love and kinship. I hope that what you read here will answer questions you've had for a long time, such as why your interactions with some family members have been so hurtful and frustrating. The good news is that by grasping the concept of emotional immaturity, you can develop more realistic expectations of other people, accepting the level of relationship possible with them instead of feeling hurt by their lack of response. Among psychotherapists, it's long been known that emotionally disengaging from toxic parents is the way to restore peace and self-sufficiency. But how does one do this? We do it by understanding what we are dealing with. What has been missing from the literature on self-involved parents is a full explanation of why there are limits on their ability to love. This book fills that gap, explaining that these parents basically lack emotional maturity. Once you understand their traits, you'll be able to judge for yourself what level of relationship might be possible or impossible with your parent. Knowing this allows us to return to ourselves, living life from our own deeper nature instead of focusing on parents who refuse to change. Understanding their emotional immaturity frees us from emotional loneliness as we realize their neglect wasn't about us, but about them. When we see why they can't be different, we can finally be free of our frustration with them, as well as our doubts about our own lovability. In this book, you'll find out why one or both of your parents couldn't give you the kind of interactions that could have nourished you emotionally. You'll learn exactly why you may have felt so unseen and unknown by your parent, and why your well-meaning efforts at communication never made things better. In Chapter 1, you'll see why people who grew up with emotionally immature parents often feel emotional loneliness. You'll read the stories of people whose lack of deep emotional connections with their parents affected their adult lives in significant ways. You'll get a detailed picture of what emotional loneliness looks like, and also see how self-awareness can help reverse feelings of isolation. Chapters 2 and 3 explore the characteristics of emotionally immature parents and the types of relationship problems they cause. Many of your parents' puzzling behaviors will start to make sense when you see them in the light of emotional immaturity. A checklist is provided to help you identify your parents' areas of emotional immaturity. You'll also gain some insight into possible reasons why your parents' emotional development stopped early. Chapter 4 describes 4 main types of emotionally immature parents and will assist you in identifying which type of parenting you may have had. You'll also learn about the self-defeating habits that children can develop in an effort to adapt to these 4 parent types. In Chapter 5, you'll see how people lose touch with their true selves in order to take on a family role, and how they build up subconscious fantasies about how other people should act in order to heal them from past neglect. You'll learn about the 2 very different types of children likely to emerge from emotionally immature parenting, internalizers and externalizers. This will also shed light on why siblings from the same family can be so vastly different in their style of functioning. In Chapter 6, I describe the internalizer personality in greater detail. This is the personality type most likely to engage in self-reflection and personal growth, and therefore most likely to be drawn to this book. Internalizers are highly perceptive and sensitive, with strong instincts to engage and connect with other people. You'll see whether this personality type fits you, especially the traits of tending to feel apologetic for needing help, doing most of the emotional work in relationships, and thinking about what other people want first. Chapter 7 addresses what happens when old patterns of relating finally break down and people begin to wake up to their unmet needs. This is the point at which people are likely to seek help in psychotherapy. I'll share stories of people who woke up from their self-denying patterns and decided to be different. In this process of admitting the truth to themselves, they regained their ability to trust their instincts and truly know themselves. In Chapter 8, I'll introduce a way of relating to people that I call the maturity awareness approach. By using the concept of emotional maturation to assess people's level of functioning, you'll begin to see their behavior in a more objective way and can observe the defining signs of immaturity as they occur. You'll learn what works and doesn't work with emotionally immature people and how to protect yourself from the emotional distress they can cause. All of this will help you gain new peace and self-confidence. In Chapter 9, you'll hear about individuals who have experienced a new sense of freedom and wholeness after using this approach. Their stories will help you see how it feels to finally get free of the guilt and confusion that parental immaturity causes. By focusing on your own self-development, you can get on the road to freedom from emotionally immature relationships. Chapter 10 describes how to identify people who will treat you well and be emotionally safe and reliable. It will also help you change the self-defeating interpersonal behaviors common to adult children of emotionally immature parents. With this new approach to relationships, emotional loneliness can be a thing of the past. After reading this book, you'll be able to spot signs of emotional immaturity and understand why you've often felt alone. It will finally make sense why your attempts at emotional intimacy have failed to create closer relationships with emotionally immature people. You'll learn to manage the overdeveloped empathy that may have held you emotionally hostage to manipulative, non-reciprocal people. Finally, you'll be able to recognize people who are capable of genuine emotional intimacy and satisfying communication. I'm excited to share my results from years of reading and research on this topic, along with fascinating stories drawn from my work with real clients. I've been on a quest to understand this topic for most of my professional life. It seems to me that a great truth has been hiding in plain sight, obscured by the social stereotypes that put parents beyond the reach of objectivity. I'm so happy to share the discoveries and conclusions that have been confirmed over and over again by the many people I've worked with. My hope is to provide relief from the confusion and emotional suffering that emotionally immature parents arouse in their children. If this book helps you understand your emotional loneliness or helps you create deeper emotional connections and more rewarding intimacy in your life, then I will have accomplished my mission. If it helps you see yourself as a worthy person who is no longer at the mercy of other people's manipulations, I will have done my job. I know you've suspected much of what you are about to read, and I'm here to tell you that you were right all along. I wish the very best for you. Chapter 1: How emotionally immature parents affect their adult children's lives. Emotional loneliness comes from not having enough emotional intimacy with other people. It can start in childhood due to feeling emotionally unseen by self-preoccupied parents, or it can arise in adulthood when an emotional connection is lost. If it's been a lifelong feeling, it points to the likelihood of not being sufficiently emotionally responded to as a child. Growing up in a family with emotionally immature parents is a lonely experience. These parents may look and act perfectly normal, caring for their child's physical health and providing meals and safety. However, if they don't make a solid emotional connection with their child, the child will have a gaping hole where true security might have been. The loneliness of feeling unseen by others is a fundamental a pain as physical injury, but it doesn't show on the outside. Emotional loneliness is a vague and private experience, not easy to see or describe. You might call it a feeling of emptiness or being alone in the world. Some people have called this feeling existential loneliness, but there's nothing existential about it. If you feel it, it came from your family. Children have no way of identifying a lack of emotional intimacy in their relationship with a parent. It isn't a concept they have, and it's even less likely that they can understand that their parents are emotionally immature. All they have is a gut feeling of emptiness, which is how a child experiences loneliness. With a mature parent, the child's remedy for loneliness is simply to go to the parent for affectionate connection. But if your parent was scared of deep feelings, you might have been left with an uneasy sense of shame for needing comforting. When the child of emotionally immature parents grow up, the core emptiness remains, even if they have a superficially normal adult life. Their loneliness can continue into adulthood if they unwittingly choose relationships that can't give them enough emotional connection. They may go to school, work, marry, and raise children, but all the while they'll still be haunted by that core sense of emotional isolation. In this chapter, we'll look at people's experience of emotional loneliness, along with how self-awareness helped them understand what they were missing and how to change. Emotional intimacy. Emotional intimacy involves knowing that you have someone you can tell anything to, someone to go to with all your feelings about anything and everything. You feel completely safe opening up to the other person, whether in the form of words, through an exchange of looks, or by just being together quietly in a state of connection. Emotional intimacy is profoundly fulfilling, creating a sense of being seen for who you really are. It can only exist when the other person seeks to know you, not judge you. As children, the basis for our security is emotional connection with our caretakers. Emotionally engaged parents make children feel that they always have someone to go to. This kind of security requires genuine emotional interactions with parents. Parents who are emotionally mature engage in this level of emotional connection almost all the time. They've developed enough self-awareness to be comfortable with their own feelings, as well as those of other people. More importantly, they're emotionally attuned to their children, noticing their children's moods and welcoming their feelings with interest. A child feels safe connecting with such a parent, whether seeking comfort or sharing enthusiasm. Mature parents make their children feel that they enjoy engaging with them and that it's fine to talk about emotional issues. These parents have a lively, balanced emotional life and are usually consistent in their attentiveness and interest toward their children. They are emotionally dependable. Emotional loneliness. Parents who are emotionally immature, on the other hand, are so self-preoccupied that they don't notice their children's inner experiences. In addition, they discount feelings and they fear emotional intimacy. They're uncomfortable with their own emotional needs and therefore have no idea how to offer support at an emotional level. Such parents may even become nervous and angry if their children get upset, punishing them instead of comforting them. These reactions shut down children's instinctive urge to reach out, closing the door to emotional contact. If one or both of your parents weren't mature enough to give you emotional support, as a child you would have felt the effects of not having it, but you wouldn't necessarily have known what was wrong. You might have thought that feeling empty and alone was your own private, strange experience, something that made you different from other people. As a child, you had no way of knowing that this hollow feeling is a normal, universal response to lacking adequate human companionship. Emotional loneliness is a term that suggests its own cure, being on the receiving end of another person's sympathetic interest in what you're feeling. This type of loneliness isn't an odd or senseless feeling. It's the predictable result of growing up without sufficient empathy from others. To round out this description of emotional loneliness, let's look at two people who vividly remember this feeling from childhood and describe it well. David's story. Here's how my client David responded when I commented that growing up in his family sounded lonely. It was incredibly lonely, like I was utterly isolated. It was a fact of my existence. It just felt normal. In my family, everyone was separate from each other, and we were all emotionally isolated. We lived parallel lives with no points of contact. In high school, I used to get this image of floating in the ocean with no one around me. That's how it felt at home. When I asked him more about the feeling of loneliness, he said, "It was a sensation of emptiness and nothingness. I had no way of knowing that most people didn't feel that way. That feeling was just daily life for me." Rhonda's story. Rhonda remembered a similar aloneness when she was 7 years old, standing by the moving truck outside her family's old house with her parents and 3 older siblings. Although she was technically with her family, no one was touching her and she felt totally alone. I was standing there with my family, but nobody had really explained what this move would mean. I felt totally alone, trying to figure out what was going on. I was with my family, but I didn't feel like I was with them. I remember feeling exhausted, wondering how I was going to deal with this on my own. I didn't feel like I could ask any questions. They were totally unavailable to me. I was too anxious to share anything with them. I knew it was on me to cope with this alone. The message within emotional loneliness. This kind of emotional pain and loneliness is actually a healthy message. The anxiety felt by David and Rhonda was letting them know that they were in dire need of emotional contact. But because their parents didn't notice how they felt, all they could do was keep their feelings inside. Fortunately, once you start listening to your emotions instead of shutting them down, they will guide you toward an authentic connection with others. Knowing the cause of your emotional loneliness is the first step toward finding more fulfilling relationships. How children cope with emotional loneliness. Emotional loneliness is so distressing that a child who experiences it will do whatever is necessary to make some kind of connection with the parent. These children may learn to put other people's needs first as the price of admission to a relationship. Instead of expecting others to provide support or show interest in them, they may take on the role of helping others, convincing everyone that they have few emotional needs of their own. Unfortunately, this tends to create even more loneliness, since covering up your deepest needs prevents a genuine connection with others. Lacking adequate parental support or connection, many emotionally deprived children are eager to leave childhood behind. They perceive that the best solution is to grow up quickly and become self-sufficient. These children become competent beyond their years, but lonely at their core. They often jump into adulthood prematurely, getting jobs as soon as they can, becoming sexually active, marrying early, or joining the service. It's as though they are saying, since I'm already taking care of myself, I might as well go ahead and get the benefits of growing up fast. They look forward to adulthood, believing it offers freedom and a chance to belong. Sadly, in their rush to leave home, they may end up marrying the wrong person, tolerating exploitation, or staying with a job that takes more than it gives. They often settle for emotional loneliness in their relationships because it feels normal to them, like their early home life. Why the past repeats itself. If the lack of emotional connection with emotionally immature parents is so painful, why do so many people end up in similarly frustrating relationships in adulthood? The most primitive parts of our brain tell us that safety lies in familiarity. We gravitate to situations we have had experience with because we know how to deal with them. As children, we don't recognize our parents' limitations because seeing our parents as immature or flawed is frightening. Unfortunately, by denying the painful truth about our parents, we aren't able to recognize similarly hurtful people in future relationships. Denial makes us repeat the same situation over and over because we never see it coming the next time. Sophie's story illustrates this dynamic well. Sophie's story. Sophie had been dating Jerry for 5 years. She had a great job as a nurse and felt lucky to have a long-term relationship. At 32, she wanted to get married, but Jerry was in no hurry. In his mind, everything was fine the way it was. He was a fun guy, but he didn't seem to want emotional intimacy and usually closed down when Sophie brought up emotional topics. Sophie was feeling deeply frustrated and sought therapy for help in figuring out what to do. It was a difficult dilemma. She loved Jerry, but she was running out of time to start a family. She also felt guilty and worried that she was asking for too much. One day, Jerry suggested that they go to the restaurant they had gone to on their first date. There was something about the way he asked that made Sophie wonder if he might propose. Sophie barely made it through dinner, trying to contain her excitement. Sure enough, after dinner, Jerry pulled a small jewelry box out of his jacket pocket. As he pushed it across the linen tablecloth, Sophie could hardly breathe, but when she opened the box, there was no ring, only a small square of paper with a question mark on it. She didn't understand. Jerry grinned at her. "Now you can tell your friends I finally popped the question." "Are you proposing?" she asked in confusion. "No, it's a joke, get it?" Sophie was shocked, furious, and deeply hurt. When she called her mother and told her about the incident, her mother actually sided with Jerry, telling Sophie it was a funny joke and she shouldn't be mad. I honestly cannot think of a single situation when this would be a good joke in a relationship. It's too deflating and demeaning. But as Sophie recognized later, her mother and Jerry had a lot in common in their insensitivity to people's feelings. Every time Sophie tried to tell them how she felt, she ended up feeling invalidated. In therapy, Sophie began to see the parallels between her mother's lack of empathy and Jerry's emotional insensitivity. She realized that in her relationship with Jerry, she had re-entered the emotional loneliness she'd felt as a child. She now saw that her frustration with Jerry's emotional unavailability wasn't something new, it was as old as her childhood. Sophie had felt that sense of unconnectedness her whole life. Feeling guilty for being unhappy. I have a special place in my heart for people like Sophie, who function so well that other people think they have no problems. In fact, their competence makes it hard for them to take their own pain seriously. I have it all, they're likely to say. I should be happy. Why do I feel so miserable? This is the classic confusion of a person whose physical needs were met in childhood while emotional needs remained unfulfilled. People like Sophie often feel guilty for complaining. Men and women alike will list the things they have to be thankful for, as if their life were an additional problem whose positive sum means nothing can be wrong. But they can't shake the feeling of being fundamentally alone and lacking the level of emotional intimacy they crave in their closest relationships. By the time they come to see me, some of them are either ready to leave their partner or are involved in an affair that gives them some of what they need. Others have avoided romantic relationships altogether, seeing emotional commitment as a trap they prefer to stay out of. Still others have decided to stay in their relationship for their children and come to therapy for help in learning how to be less angry and resentful. Few of these people walk into my office with the thought that their lack of satisfying emotional intimacy started in childhood. They are usually mystified as to how they ended up in a life that doesn't make them happy. They struggle with feelings of selfishness for wanting something more out of life. As Sophie initially said, relationships are always going to have frustrations. It's work, right? She was partly right. Good relationships do take some effort and forbearance, but it shouldn't take work just to be noticed. Making an emotional connection ought to be the easy part. Emotional loneliness transcends gender. Although women still outnumber men in seeking psychotherapy, I've worked with many men who have faced the same issue of feeling lonely in their primary relationship. In some ways, it's even more poignant for them because our culture maintains that males have fewer emotional needs, but taking a look at the rates of suicide and violence reveals that this isn't true. Men are more likely to become violent or succeed at suicide when they feel emotionally anguished. Men who lack emotional intimacy, a sense of belonging, or caring attention can feel as empty as anybody else, though they may resist showing it. Emotional connection is a basic human need, regardless of gender. Children who feel they cannot engage their parents emotionally often try to strengthen their connection by playing whatever roles they believe their parents want them to. Although this may win them some fleeting approval, it doesn't yield genuine emotional closeness. Emotionally disconnected parents don't suddenly develop a capacity for empathy just because a child does something to please them. People who lacked emotional engagement in childhood, men and women alike, often can't believe that someone would want to have a relationship with them just because of who they are. They believe that if they want closeness, they must play a role that always puts the other person first. Jake's story. Jake had recently married Kayla, a bubbly woman who made him feel genuinely loved. He was happy when he got married, but now he couldn't shake a feeling of being very down in the dumps. I should be happy, he said. I'm the luckiest guy in the world, and I'm trying hard to be the person she wants me to be, but I feel like I'm acting, forcing myself to be more upbeat than I really am. I hate feeling like I'm faking it. I asked Jake who he thought he should be with Kayla. I should be a person who is super happy like she is. I need to make her feel loved and keep her happy. That's the way it's supposed to be. He looked at me expectantly for confirmation, but when I just waited, he went on. When she comes home from work, I try hard to act really happy and excited, but it's more than I'm really feeling. I'm exhausted. I asked him what he thought would happen if he were to honestly tell Kayla about the strain he felt, and he said she would be devastated and furious if I tried to talk to her about it. I told Jake that I believed sharing his honest feelings might have enraged someone in his past, but it didn't sound like how Kayla would respond. It sounded more like what he had told me about his angry mother, who was quick to blow up if people didn't do what she wanted. Jake's secure relationship with Kayla was tempting him to relax and be himself, but he was sure that his relationship would suffer if he stopped trying so hard. When I told Jake that maybe this safe new relationship was giving him a chance to finally be loved for himself, he was uncomfortable with the reference to his emotional needs. He looked embarrassed and said, "When you say it like that, I sound pitiful and needy." During childhood, Jake had gotten the message from his mother that showing any emotional needs meant he was weak. Further, if he didn't act how she wanted him to, he felt inadequate and unlovable. Jake was eventually able to understand his feelings and become more genuine with Kayla, who totally accepted him. But he was astounded by how much anger toward his mother we'd unearthed. "I can't believe how much I hated her," he said. What Jake didn't realize is that hate is a normal and involuntary reaction when somebody tries to control you for no good reason. It signals that the person is extinguishing your emotional life force by getting his or her needs met at your expense. Feeling trapped in taking care of parents. It isn't only in romantic relationships that people may feel deep emotional loneliness. I've worked with single people who have similar stories, but their unhappy adult relationships are played out with parents or friends. Typically, their relationships with their parents are so draining that they don't have the emotional energy to pursue romantic relationships, nor do they want to. Their experiences with their parents have taught them that relationships mean feeling abandoned and burdened at the same time. To these people, relationships feel like traps. They already have their hands full with a parent who acts like he or she owns them. Louise's story. Louise, a single school teacher in her late 20s, felt completely dominated by her controlling mother, a gruff ex-policewoman who expected Louise to live with her and take care of her. Her demands were so excessive that Louise started having suicidal thoughts. Louise's therapist told her in no uncertain terms that her life depended on getting away from her mother's control. When Louise told her mother she was leaving, her mother said, "That's not going to happen. You'd feel awful about yourself. Besides, I can't get along without you." Fortunately, Louise summoned the strength to establish her own independent life. In the process, she discovered that guilt was a manageable emotion and a small price to pay for her freedom. Not trusting your instincts. Emotionally immature parents don't know how to validate their child's feelings and instincts. Without this validation, children learn to give in to what others seem sure about. As adults, they may deny their instincts to the point where they acquiesce to relationships they don't really want. They may then believe it's up to them to make the relationship work. They may rationalize why they have to try so hard in the relationship, as though it were normal to struggle daily to get along with your mate. While effort is needed to maintain communication and connection in a relationship, it shouldn't feel like constant, unrewarding work. The truth is, if both partners fit each other, understand each other's feelings, and are positive and supportive, relationships are primarily pleasurable, not arduous. It isn't asking too much to generally feel happy when you see your partner or look forward to time together. When people say, "You can't have everything," they're really saying they don't have what they need. As a human being, you can trust yourself to know when you're emotionally satisfied. You know when you've been given full measure. You aren't a bottomless pit of ceaseless demands. You can trust the inner prompts that tell you when something is missing. But if you've been trained to discount your feelings, you'll feel guilty for complaining if everything looks okay on the outside. If you have a place to live, a regular paycheck, enough food, and a partner or friends, conventional wisdom says, how bad can it be? Many people can readily enumerate all the reasons why they should be satisfied and be shy about admitting that they aren't. They blame themselves for not having the right feelings. Megan's story. Megan broke up with her boyfriend twice before getting pregnant in her first year of college. Although her boyfriend wanted to get married, the relationship just didn't feel right to her. However, her parents were crazy about her boyfriend, who came from a wealthy family, and pushed her to marry him, especially with a baby on the way, and Megan gave in. Her husband became a successful real estate broker, adding to his appeal for her parents. Years later, with 3 children finally in college, she was ready to end her marriage, but she felt confused and guilty about wanting to leave. In our first session, Megan said, "I don't know how to express myself." Neither her husband nor her parents could understand why she wasn't satisfied with the way things were, and she couldn't find the words to defend her feelings. For every explanation she stumbled through, they countered with several reasons why she was wrong. They discounted her reasons because her complaints were emotional, like not being listened to, having her feelings and requests disregarded, and not having any fun with her husband. She tried to explain to them that she and her husband weren't compatible socially, sexually, or in their activities. Megan's real problem wasn't that she didn't know how to express herself, it was that her family didn't want to hear her. Her husband and parents weren't trying to understand, they were focused on trying to convince her she was mistaken. Megan felt embarrassed and guilty because her emotional needs were outweighing her vows and commitments. But as I pointed out to her, vows and promises aren't the fuel relationships run on. Relationships are sustained by the pleasure of emotional intimacy, the feeling that someone is interested in taking the time to really listen and understand your experience. If you don't have that, your relationship won't thrive. Mutual emotional responsiveness is the single most essential ingredient of human relationships. Megan feared she was a bad person for wanting to leave her husband. When people can no longer tolerate an emotionally unrewarding relationship, how should we characterize their desire to leave? Are they being selfish, impulsive, or hard-hearted? Are they giving up prematurely, or perhaps just being plain immoral? If they've taken it all this time, why can't they take it a little more? Why rock the boat? The point might exactly be that they have taken it for so long. Perhaps they've literally used up all the energy they had to give, like Megan, who had spent years trying to give her husband and parents what they expected. Megan had repeatedly tried to explain her feelings and tell them how unhappy she was. She even tried to get through to her husband by leaving him letters to read. But neither he nor her parents listened. Instead, they responded with what they wanted her to do, the classic egocentric response of emotionally immature people. Fortunately, Megan finally began to take her own feelings seriously and quit letting her husband and parents deny her emotional needs with arguments that were emotionally irrelevant to her. When Megan finally realized what she really wanted from a relationship, she shyly told me, "I want to matter the most to someone. I want someone to want to be with me." Then she looked confused and said, "Is that too much to ask? I really don't know." Since childhood, Megan had been trained to think that her natural desire to feel special and loved was selfish. Throughout her marriage, her husband reinforced this by telling her that she wanted too much and her expectations were too high, until she stopped believing that he knew more about her than she did. Lacking self-confidence due to parental rejection. When parents reject or emotionally neglect their children, these children often grow up to expect the same from other people. They lack confidence that others could be interested in them. Instead of asking for what they want, their low self-confidence makes them shy and conflicted about seeking attention. They're convinced they would be bothering others if they tried to make their needs known. Unfortunately, by expecting past rejection to repeat itself, these children end up stifling themselves and promoting more emotional loneliness. In this situation, people create their own emotional loneliness by hanging back instead of interacting. As a therapist, my job is to help them realize how their parents have damaged their self-confidence while also encouraging them to tolerate the anxiety of trying something new in order to connect more with others. As the next two stories show, people are capable of doing this. It just may not occur to them to reach out because they simply don't have much experience with other people helping them feel better. Ben's story. Ben had suffered from anxiety and depression for much of his life. He characterized his mother as a rejecting woman who kept him at arm's length. She was imperious and had made it clear that he held a low place in the family pecking order. As a child, Ben's needs and feelings simply weren't a primary concern, and he was expected to wait until the adults were ready to pay attention to him. Fortunately, Ben married a kind and affectionate woman, Alexa, but he was baffled as to why she had chosen him. As he put it, "I'm not a very interesting person. I don't know why Alexa likes me. I'm not exactly a nobody, but..." The way Ben's voice trailed off indicated that he saw himself as someone who could easily be overlooked and taken for granted. Ben's childhood experience of his mother's rejection had clearly deflated his self-confidence. Further, it had convinced him that others would find his emotional needs as repugnant as his mother had. One day in session, Ben talked about how unhappy and overwhelmed he was feeling. When I asked if he'd confided in Alexa about how he was feeling, he said, "No, I can't. She's got her own stuff to deal with. I don't want her to see me as this wuss who can't deal with his own issues." When I said it seemed unlikely Alexa would do that, he agreed. "I know she loves me for just being myself, but I don't feel that way about myself." When I suggested to Ben that he could try opening up to Alexa, given how supportive she was, he told me he thought he should be more self-reliant, saying, "I should be able to weather this on my own. Isn't it up to me to meet my own emotional needs?" What a lonely thought. I told Ben that we all need other people to meet our emotional needs for comfort and closeness. That's what relationships are all about. Charlotte's story. Charlotte provides another example of this tendency to see current situations through the lens of past parental rejection. She had finally accepted a friend's repeated invitations to enter a short story in a writing contest. She was sure the judges would reject her work, even though she was a successful newspaper journalist. To her astonishment, she won. For Charlotte, this stirred up painful memories of all the times in childhood when she was criticized and shamed by her parents for trying to stand out. Her parents weren't capable of emotional support and instead found reasons to disparage her accomplishments. Now, even as she was thrilled about her award, she simultaneously felt terrified that someone would step forward to mock her or expose her as undeserving. Instead of sharing her happiness with everyone, she kept it to herself, telling herself no one was interested. Childhood loneliness beneath adult success. Parental rejection doesn't always result in low self-confidence. Some intelligent, resilient people somehow manifest the confidence to pursue good careers and reach high levels of achievement. Many find emotionally mature partners, enjoy satisfying long-term relationships, and create close families of their own. But despite their emotional needs being met in current relationships, the lingering trauma of childhood loneliness may haunt them in other ways through anxiety, depression, or bad dreams. Natalie's story. Natalie, 50, an award-winning business consultant, was an emotionally neglected child who nevertheless created a rewarding adult life for herself both personally and professionally. Unfortunately, the emotional neglect she experienced as a child still haunts her in the form of dreams, which she described like this: "I have recurring nightmares with the same theme. I'm in a desperate situation that I can't get out of. I'm trying frantically to find a solution, a way out. Different roads, different keys, different doors, none of them are a solution. I'm all alone and there's only me trying to solve the problem. There's no one else. Lots of times I'm responsible for other people who are watching and waiting for me to fix everything. But here they give me no help. There is no comfort to be found. I have no protection and I'm not safe. Then I wake up and my heart is racing." Natalie's dream captures what it feels like to be emotionally alone. She has to deal with everything by herself and doesn't consider asking anyone for help. This is how children of emotionally immature parents feel. Their parents may technically be present, but they offer little help, protection, or comfort. In her family life, Natalie still takes care of her elderly mother, who lives with Natalie and her husband and kids. But no matter how much Natalie does, her mother still complains that Natalie has never loved her or helped her enough. Since childhood, Natalie has felt the responsibility for her mother's emotional state. Meanwhile, Natalie was on her own because her mother wasn't a person she could turn to. Children like Natalie often grow up as little adults, helping their parents, giving them no trouble, and appearing to need practically nothing. These capable kids may seem like they can parent themselves, but they can't. No child can. They just learn to cling to whatever emotional scraps they get because any connection is better than none at all. Yet who would guess Natalie's early insecurities as she strides into meetings, all business in her impeccable suits. She has a good marriage, successful children, and close friendships. She knows how to relate to people from all walks of life, and her emotional intelligence is off the charts. Natalie's dreams pull back the curtain to reveal the emotional loneliness that remains within her. Despite creating a fulfilling adult life, inside she remains vulnerable to anxieties about being alone and unsupported. Not until she was nearly 50 did she begin to understand how her relationship with her mother fueled her underlying feelings of anxiety. That was one of the most meaningful discoveries of her life. Finally, she saw the reason for those nightmares. Why it feels so bad to live without emotional connection. There's a reason why people have such a strong need for emotional connection with others. Throughout human evolution, being part of a group has always meant more safety and less stress. Our ancestors who most disliked separation were more likely to survive because they enjoyed the safe feeling of being close to others. Early humans who didn't mind isolation, on the other hand, may have been comfortable with more distance than was good for their survival. So when you're longing for a deep emotional connection, remind yourself that your painful feeling of aloneness is coming not just from your individual history, but also from human genetic memory. Just like you, our distant ancestors had a strong need for emotional closeness. Your need for attention and connection is as old as the human race. You have prehistoric reasons for not liking to be lonely. Summary: a lack of emotional intimacy creates emotional loneliness in both children and adults. Attentive and reliable emotional relationships are the basis of a child's sense of security. Unfortunately, emotionally immature parents are usually too uncomfortable with closeness to give their children the deep emotional connection they need. Parental neglect and rejection in childhood can adversely affect self-confidence and relationships in adulthood, as people repeat old, frustrating patterns and then blame themselves for not being happy. Even adult success doesn't completely erase the effects of parental disconnection earlier in life. Understanding how your parents' emotional immaturity has affected you is the best way to avoid repeating the past in your adult relationships. To that end, in the next chapter, we'll look at the hallmark characteristics of emotionally immature parents. Chapter 2. Recognizing the emotionally immature parent. It can be hard to look at your parents objectively because it might feel like you're betraying them, but that isn't the motive here. In this book, our mission is not to disrespect or betray your parents, but to finally see them objectively. I hope you'll see that the discussions of emotionally immature parents in this book are informed by a deep understanding of the reasons for their limitations. As you'll see, much of their immature, hurtful behavior is unintentional. By viewing these and other aspects of your parents more dispassionately, you can understand things about yourself and your history that you might not have thought about before. Most signs of emotional immaturity are beyond a person's conscious control, and most emotionally immature parents have no awareness of how they've affected their children. We aren't trying to blame these parents, but to understand why they are the way they are. My hope is that any new insights about your parent you gain from reading this book will have the result of radically increasing your own self-awareness and emotional freedom. Fortunately, as adults, we have the ability and independence to assess whether our parents can really give us the care and understanding we desire. To judge this objectively, it's important to understand not just your parents' superficial behavioral characteristics, but also their underlying emotional framework. Once you understand these deeper traits and learn what to expect from your parents and how to label their behaviors, you're far less likely to be caught unaware by their limitations. Keep in mind that your thoughts about your parents are private. They may never know what you've gotten from this book, nor do they need to. The goal is for you to gain the self-confidence that comes from knowing the truth of your own story. You aren't betraying your parents by seeing them accurately. Thinking about them objectively can't hurt them, but it can help you. As you saw in the previous chapter, emotionally immature parents can have devastating impacts on their children's self-esteem and relationships in adulthood. The effects can range from mild to severe, depending on the parent's level of immaturity, but the net effect is the same. The children feel emotionally unseen and lonely. This erodes their children's sense of their own lovability and can lead to excessive caution about emotional intimacy with others. Exercise. Assessing your parents' emotional immaturity. Human emotional immaturity has been studied for a long time. However, over the years, it has lost ground to an increasing focus on symptoms and clinical diagnosis, using a medical disease model to quantify behaviors as illnesses suitable for insurance reimbursement. But in terms of a deep understanding of people, assessing emotional immaturity is often far more useful, as you're likely to discover when reading this chapter and by completing this exercise. Read through the following statements and check any that describe your parent. If you'd like to fill out this assessment for more than one parent or step-parent, use the downloadable version of this exercise available at website. See the back of the book for instructions on how to access it. My parent often overreacted to relatively minor things. My parent didn't express much empathy or emotional awareness. When it came to emotional closeness and feelings, my parent seemed uncomfortable and didn't go there. My parent was often irritated by individual differences or different points of view. When I was growing up, my parent used me as a confidant, but wasn't a confidant for me. My parent often said and did things without thinking about people's feelings. I didn't get much attention or sympathy from my parent, except maybe when I was really sick. My parent was inconsistent, sometimes wise, sometimes unreasonable. If I became upset, my parent either said something superficial and unhelpful or got angry and sarcastic. Conversations mostly centered on my parents' interests. Even polite disagreement could make my parent very defensive. It was deflating to tell my parent about my successes because it didn't seem to matter. Facts and logic were no match for my parents' opinions. My parent wasn't self-reflective and rarely looked at his or her role in a problem. My parent tended to be a black and white thinker and unreceptive to new ideas. How many of these statements describe your parent? Since all these items are potential signs of emotional immaturity, checking more than one suggests you very well may have been dealing with an emotionally immature parent. Personality pattern versus temporary emotional regression. There's a difference between a pattern of emotional immaturity and a temporary emotional regression. Anyone can briefly lose emotional control or become impulsive when tired or stressed. and most of us have plenty to cringe about when we look back on certain moments in our lives. However, when a person has a personality pattern of emotional immaturity, certain behaviors show up repeatedly. These behaviors are so automatic and unconscious that people are unaware of doing them. Emotionally immature people don't step back and think about how their behavior impacts others. There's no cringe factor for them, so they seldom apologize or experience regret. Defining maturity. Before we explore emotional immaturity, let's take a look at emotionally mature functioning. Emotional maturity isn't a murky matter of opinion. It has been well and famously studied. Emotional maturity means a person is capable of thinking objectively and conceptually while sustaining deep emotional connections to others. People who are emotionally mature can function independently while also having deep emotional attachments, smoothly incorporating both into their daily life. They are direct about pursuing what they want, yet do so without exploiting other people. They've differentiated from their original family relationships sufficiently to build a life of their own. They have a well-developed sense of self and identity and treasure their closest relationships. Emotionally mature people are comfortable and honest about their own feelings and get along well with other people, thanks to their well-developed empathy, impulse control, and emotional intelligence. They're interested in other people's lives and enjoy opening up and sharing with others in an emotionally intimate way. When there's a problem, they deal with others directly to smooth out differences. Emotionally mature people cope with stress in a realistic, forward-looking way while consciously processing their thoughts and feelings. They can control their emotions when necessary, anticipate the future, adapt to reality, and use empathy and humor to ease difficult situations and strengthen bonds with others. They enjoy being objective and know themselves well enough to admit their weaknesses. Personality traits associated with emotional immaturity. Emotionally immature people, on the other hand, tend to have quite a different set of behavioral, emotional, and mental characteristics. Because these personality characteristics are all interconnected, people who display one are often prone to the others. In the sections that follow, I'll briefly describe various characteristics of emotionally immature people. They are rigid and single-minded. As long as there's a clear path to follow, emotionally immature people can do very well, sometimes reaching high levels of success and prestige, but when it comes to relationships or emotional decisions, their immaturity becomes evident. They are either rigid or impulsive and try to cope with reality by narrowing it down to something manageable. Once they form an opinion, their minds are closed. There's one right answer, and they can become very defensive and humorless when people have other ideas. They have low stress tolerance. Emotionally immature people don't deal with stress well. Their responses are reactive and stereotyped. Instead of assessing the situation and anticipating the future, they use coping mechanisms that deny, distort, or replace reality. They have trouble admitting mistakes and instead discount the facts and blame others. Regulating emotions is difficult for them, and they often overreact. Once they get upset, it's hard for them to calm down, and they expect other people to soothe them by doing what they want. They often seek comfort in intoxicants or medication. They do what feels best. Young children are ruled by feelings, whereas adults consider possible consequences. As we mature, we learn that what feels good isn't always the best thing to do. Among emotionally immature people, however, the childhood instinct to do what feels good never really changes. They make decisions on the basis of what feels best in the moment and often follow the path of least resistance. If you're a mature person and think before you act, you might find it hard to imagine living by what feels good in the moment. So here's an example of the jaw-dropping behavior of the emotionally immature person. Anna convinced her brother Tom to come with her to talk to their elderly father about going into assisted living. After visiting with their father a bit, the time came to talk seriously. Suddenly, Tom was nowhere to be found. Anna searched the house and then looked out the front window in time to see her brother getting in his car and leaving. Anna was incredulous and wondered how Tom could run out like that. But when you realize that, in that moment, walking out of the house felt much better than staying for a difficult confrontation, it makes sense. They're subjective, not objective. Emotionally immature people assess situations in a subjective way, not objectively. They don't do much dispassionate analysis. When they interpret situations, how they are feeling is more important than what is actually happening. What is true doesn't matter nearly as much as what feels true. Trying to get a subjectively oriented person to be objective about anything is an exercise in futility. facts, logic, history, all fall on deaf ears where the emotionally immature are concerned. They have little respect for differences. Emotionally immature people are annoyed by other people's differing thoughts and opinions, believing everyone should see things their way. The idea that other people are entitled to their own point of view is beyond them. They may be prone to make social gaffes because they don't have enough awareness of other people's individuality to avoid being offensive. They're only comfortable in role-defined relationships where everyone holds the same beliefs. The quieter, nicer ones are the same, but in a quieter, nicer way. They are egocentric. Normal children are egocentric as youngsters, but the self-involvement of emotionally immature adults is more childish than childlike. Unlike children, their egocentrism lacks joy and openness. Emotionally immature people are self-preoccupied in an obsessed way, not with the innocence of a child. Young children are self-centered because they're still commanded by pure instinct, but emotionally immature adults are commanded by anxiety and insecurity, like wounded people who must keep checking their intactness. They live in a perpetual state of insecurity, fearing that they'll be exposed as bad, inadequate, or unlovable. They keep their defenses high so other people can't get close enough to threaten their shaky sense of self-worth. Before you start feeling too sorry for them, keep in mind that their defenses work seamlessly to keep these underlying anxieties below the level of awareness. They would never see themselves as being insecure or defensive. They are self-preoccupied and self-involved. Anxious self-preoccupation is a quality all emotionally immature people share. They're constantly monitoring whether their needs are being met or whether something has offended them. Their self-esteem rises or falls depending on how others react to them. They can't stand to be criticized, so they minimize their mistakes. Because their self-involvement is all-consuming, other people's feelings are eclipsed by their needs. For instance, after one woman told her mother how much it hurt to hear criticisms of her father, her mother said, "Well, if I couldn't tell you, I wouldn't have anybody to talk to." Terms like self-absorbed and narcissistic make it sound as if these people enjoy thinking about themselves all the time, but they really have no choice in the matter. They have fundamental doubts about their core worth as human beings. They are profoundly self-involved because their development was stunted by anxiety during childhood. In this way, their egocentrism is more like the self-preoccupation of someone with a chronic pain condition rather than someone who can't get enough of himself or herself. They are self-referential, not self-reflective. Emotionally immature people are highly self-referential, meaning that in any interaction, all roads lead back to them. However, they aren't self-reflective. Their focus on themselves isn't about gaining insight or self-understanding, it's about being the center of attention. As you talk to them, self-referential people will turn whatever you say back to one of their own experiences. An example would be a mother listening to her daughter describe a relationship crisis and using it as a springboard to talk about her own divorce. Another example would be parents who upstage their child's victory with recollections of their own accomplishments. Those who are more socially skilled might listen more politely, but you still won't hold their interest. They may not overtly change the subject, but they won't ask follow-up questions or express curiosity about the details of your experience. They're more likely to bring the conversation to a close with a pleasant comment that effectively ends it, such as, "That's wonderful, dear. I know you had a good time." Because they lack self-reflection, emotionally immature people don't consider their role in a problem. They don't assess their behavior or question their motives. If they caused a problem, they dismiss it by saying they didn't intend to hurt you. After all, you can't blame them for something they didn't mean to do, right? In this way, their egocentric focus remains on their intention, not the impact on you. They like to be the center of attention. Like children, emotionally immature people usually end up being the center of attention. In groups, the most emotionally immature person often dominates the group's time and energy. If other people allow it, all the group's attention will go to that person, and once this happens, it's hard to redirect the group's focus. If anyone else is going to get a chance to be heard, someone will have to force an abrupt transition, something many people aren't willing to do. You may wonder whether these people are just being extroverted. They aren't. The difference is that most extroverts easily follow a change of topic. Because extroverts crave interaction, not just an audience, they're interested and receptive when others participate. Extroverts do like to talk, but not with the purpose of shutting everyone else down. They promote role reversal. Role reversal is a hallmark of emotionally immature parenting. In this case, the parent relates to the child as if the child were the parent, expecting attentiveness and comfort from the child. These parents may reverse roles and expect their child to be their confidant, even for adult matters. Parents who discuss their marriage problems with their children are an example of this kind of reversal. Other times, parents might expect their children to praise them and be happy for them, just as a child might expect from a parent. One woman I worked with, Laura, remembered her father running off with another woman, leaving Laura, then just 8 years old, to cope with her severely depressed mother on her own. One day, Laura's father picked her up in a new convertible, giddy with excitement over his new toy. He expected her to be as thrilled as he was, never considering the contrast between his joyful new life and the gloom Laura lived in with her abandoned mother. Here's another example of a father who expected his daughter to function in an approving, almost parental role, in spite of his past abuse of her. Frida's story. Frida, a woman in her late 30s, had grown up in a household dominated by fear. Her father, Martin, tended to express his emotional immaturity through physical aggression. Although he was an upstanding citizen at work and in public life, at home he slapped his children and beat them with a belt to the point of leaving marks. When Frida finally stood up to him as a teenager, he stopped beating her, but he kept it up with her younger sister. He was also verbally demeaning to Frida's mother. Martin was an unpredictable man, sometimes impatient and angry, sometimes generous, happy, and loving, depending on how his day was going. But in general, rather than being a parent to his children, Martin expected them to soothe his feelings, make him the center of attention, and exhibit self-control. In a classic case of role reversal, he demanded their unconditional approval while he indulged his own moods like a child. Frida was especially the target of this role reversal, with Martin clearly expecting her to show an almost maternal love and admiration for him. For example, after Frida had moved out to her own townhouse, Martin decided she needed a porch swing, and not just any swing, but one he made himself from heavy lumber. Without asking, he had it delivered to her small deck, where it took up most of the space she had to enjoy sitting outside. It was huge and impossible to move around, which struck Frida as the perfect analogy for how Martin took up all the space in the family. He was as proud of himself as a kid who had just presented his mother with an art project. Fortunately, after understanding her father's immaturity and the dynamics involved in their role reversal, Frida felt free to have the swing removed, restoring her deck to the way she liked it. They have low empathy and are emotionally insensitive. Impaired empathy is a central characteristic of emotionally immature people, as is avoidance of emotional sharing and intimacy. Being out of touch with their own deeper feelings, they're strikingly blind to how they make other people feel. Empathy isn't just a social nicety, like being tactful. It's a necessity for true emotional intimacy. You can't have a deep relationship without it. My favorite definition of empathy comes from infant attachment researchers Klaus and Karen Grossman and Anna Schwann, who described empathy as a sensitive mother's ability to see and to feel states and intentions from the baby's point of view. This definition includes being aware of both emotions and intentions. Beyond just sympathy, it entails correctly reading people's interests and how their will is being directed. The highest form of empathy requires an effort of imagination, which has been called mentalization, meaning the ability to imagine that other people have their own unique minds and thought processes. Developmental psychologists refer to this as having a theory of mind. Acquiring this ability is an important developmental milestone for children. Mentalizing allows you to grasp other people's viewpoints and overall inner experience because you realize they have a mind of their own, different from yours. Good parents are excellent at empathizing and mentalizing. Their interest in their child's mind makes the child feel seen and understood. It's also an indispensable characteristic for leadership in business, the military, or any situation where understanding and predicting the motives of others is central. Empathy is a bedrock component of emotional intelligence, which is essential to social and occupational success.